Right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this session where you are going to meet our prize winner of this year, Professor Richard Tremblay, who is going to have his lecture about what are his main findings. We again have a person who is getting his prize for the lifetime achievement. And I know, not having that many publications as Professor Tremblay is having that you can't tell you about everything. So he has to make the choice, but choices will be his. We are extremely proud to have him as the prize winner, and I hope that it will be very good and interesting experience for all of us. May I to start with invite my co-chair, Professor Lawrence Sherman from Cambridge University, to introduce prize winner's work. Thank you.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Professor Sarnecki. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce not only this year's winner, but in keeping with our efforts to remind people of the exemplars for the field of criminology who have already been recognized by the Stockholm Prize in Criminology. I'd just like to ask some people who I believe are here, if I can risk the embarrassment of being wrong about this, to just stand and be recognized as previous winners of the Stockholm Prize. David Farrington, right here. Thank you, David. From Cambridge University, Friedrich Lösel from the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg and Cambridge University. Professor Daniel Nagin from Carnegie Mellon University. Professor David Weisberg from the George Mason University and Hebrew University. Professor Kathy Spatz-Whittam from the City University of New York, John Jay College of Criminal Justice. And if P.O. Wikström is here from Cambridge University, I hope he'll stand up. But thank you. If I haven't called on anybody, you can stand up yourself if you won the prize, and that will help. But I think it's particularly important for the people who have come up to me several times today to begin a conversation with the words, "I'm not a criminologist, but..." And my response to that is, first of all, well, you're here, aren't you? And secondly, criminology is a field that is not really defined by the formal training that you have received. We don't have a license to practice criminology, to my knowledge, anywhere in the world. It's a field defined by people's interests, and it's a field defined by the phenomenon to be explained, rather than, as in the case of some disciplines, with the independent variable with which to explain things. So it's very important to point this out in light of the fact that our winner this year was not trained as a criminologist, but as a physical education major. Now, most of the PE majors I know spend their undergraduate years drinking a lot of beer and maybe playing some football. But not many of them go on to win prizes for outstanding scientific work in Stockholm. So I'm really thrilled to introduce one of the main reasons that the prize winner was selected by the jury this year, and that is his capacity to build and cross bridges, not just from physical education as his undergraduate major to other subjects about behavior in his graduate work, but in his scholarship and the way in which he has advanced criminology with a variety of labels and in a stunning range of journals of different disciplinary character, so that I think that there are actually three bridges that we can associate with Richard Tremblay. One of them is to cross the barrier from his own training in psychology and psychiatry into the subject matter of criminology. It's the kind of bridging that I think is most common and which really is associated with everybody here who's interested in these issues without having been formally trained in criminology or even have an appointment in a criminology department. The second bridge, which I think is much more important, is reflective of his starting out by studying the way the body works in exercise and sports. And it's this barrier that Douglas Massey, as president of the American Sociological Association, described as the last frontier, the barrier between external behaviors and getting inside the body or inside the brain, and having a recognition of the futility of trying to study human behavior without taking into account both what's going on inside the body and what's going on outside the body. And you'll hear, I think, some very impressive work in relation to epigenetics and social factors and psychological factors and other ways of tying together these different perspectives on behavior. But the third bridge associated with this prize winner in 2017 is not the fact that he speaks both French and English, but we're very grateful for that. Very happy to increase our language range in the group of prize winners. It's the bridge between theoretical and basic science and applied policy relevant science. In the work that he has done, I think he has done the best job I've ever seen of putting together the basic science in a way that makes sense for an experimental test of a practice that can help to produce lasting influence on human behavior. And I think, as most experimental criminologists know, the odds are when you launch an experiment that even if you implement the experiment properly, so it's a good experiment, the odds are that the treatment's not going to work. In fact, in cancer research, you have to get, I think, up into the hundreds of thousands of attempts to find an effective cancer therapy before one of them actually works. And they've often said that's because they don't really have enough basic science behind it. You could say that about criminology, but what Richard Tremblay has done is to take such a breadth and depth of basic science to put things together in a kind of prevention strategy that is currently being tested with the earliest possible point of life to be influenced. But it also builds on his success in a 34% reduction in in criminal history by early 20s of boys who were randomly assigned to a program he designed in Montreal schools when they were 7 to 9 years old. So for all of these reasons, we are utterly delighted to celebrate the success in making major advances in criminological knowledge that not only have the potential to reduce human suffering, but have actually succeeded in doing that. Please welcome Professor Richard Tremblay.
Thank you very much, Larry and Jerzy. Before giving this lecture, I want to point out that the work I have done as a true sportsman is a team effort. A very large team effort. It is very clear to me that I could not have done otherwise. I especially want to thank the 518 colleagues with whom I have co-authored papers. My secretary, when I asked her to do this, she said, "I can't do that in one page." As illustrated by the Cain and Abel story in the Bible, the topic of aggression among humans is probably as old as humanity. And the questions concerning the developmental origins of aggression were investigated by many philosophers from ancient Greece to modern times. Not surprisingly, from a historical perspective, a central issue over the centuries has been the nature versus nurture origin of physical violence. For example, Aristotle, in his book on politics, concluded that humans grow from irrational to rational behavior because anger and will and desire are implanted in a child from their very birth, but reason and understanding develop as they grow older. Some 800 years later, St. Augustine played a major role in developing the idea of original sin, based in part on his observations of young children's aggressive behavior. The same line of reasoning was followed 1,200 years later by the British philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who noted that unless you give infants everything they want, they cry and get angry, they even beat their own parents. He then concluded, thus an evil man is rather like a sturdy boy or a man of childish mind. And even went on to describe the genetic and environmental mechanisms. Evil is simply want of reason at an age when it normally accrues to men by nature. So he would have been referring to genetics, governed by discipline, the environment, parents and teachers, and experience of harm, that is fighting with peers. You learn that it hurts. A century later, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, one of the most influential philosophers of the Enlightenment, and still a reference for many educational specialists, strongly opposed Hobbes' genetic mechanism. In the first phrase of his famous book on the education of children, God makes all things good, man meddles with them, and they become evil. A few pages later, he summarized the research agenda for many developmental psychologists, sociologists, and criminologists over the past century. There is no original sin in the human heart. The how and why of the entrance of every vice can be traced. One of the best illustrations of the modern nature-nurture clash concerning the development of aggression is found in two books published half a century ago. In his book titled On Aggression, the ethologist Konrad Lorenz concluded from his studies of animal behavior that humans, like other animals, inherited an aggressive instinct which could lead to the destruction of humanity. A few years later, in a book titled Aggression, A Social Learning Perspective, the psychologist Albert Bandura summarized his studies of children in a laboratory situation where they were shown to spontaneously imitate an adult hitting a Bobo doll, and essentially concluded what Rousseau had concluded 200 years earlier: people are not born with preformed repertoires of aggressive behavior. They must learn them in one way or another. It is probably fair to say that most social scientists trained during the last 30 years of the 20th century were convinced that humans learn to aggress from their environment, and most biologists trained during that period were convinced that humans, like other animals, instinctively use aggression. Fortunately, during that same period, large-scale longitudinal studies were specifically planned to investigate the developmental mechanisms by which children learn to aggress from their environment. Some of these studies were driven by the hypothesis that children were becoming more aggressive because of violence on television. The first prospective longitudinal studies with yearly assessment of physical aggression of school-aged children reported surprising results from a social learning perspective. If observing physical aggression on television increased children's use of physical aggression, we expected that the frequency of aggressions would increase with age, since the exposition to violence on television increases with age. Results from longitudinal studies surprisingly showed a decrease in the frequency of physical aggressions from school entry to adolescence. To rule out the hypothesis that a group of children were increasing their frequency of aggression with age, while most others decreased this frequency of aggression, a former Stockholm Prize winner, Daniel Nagin, suggested that we use group-based trajectory modeling of the data. The results from that study and many others that followed showed that no significant group of children went from low frequency of physical aggressions during childhood to high frequency during adolescence. Those who frequently aggressed in adolescence were those who frequently aggressed during childhood. Because these longitudinal studies during middle childhood and adolescence suggested that children learn to aggress from their environment before school entry, we initiated longitudinal studies of physical aggression development with birth cohorts. Results showed that physical aggression is often initiated during the first years of life, substantially increases in frequency with physical growth up to 3-4 years of age, and then starts decreasing. Here is a sample of violence among the little angels.
Frappe violemment. Maxime ne veut pas partager ses jouets. Aujourd'hui, à Dr Nadia, psychologue à domicile.
Ça se résume souvent par une claque. Il est assis sur quelque chose, il pousse, il jette à terre. C'est assez violent comme conflit quand ça éclate. Puis il élève le ton. Comment vous intervenez quand il y a un conflit?
So this video of two brothers fighting over toys when they are clearly abundant is a good example of how Rousseau was when he wrote. The first who, having enclosed a piece of ground, saying, "This is mine," and found people simple enough to believe him, was the real founder of civil society. From how many crimes, wars, and murders, from how many horrors and misfortunes, might not anyone have saved mankind by pulling up the stakes or filling up the ditch and crying to his fellows, "Beware of listening to this impostor. You are undone if you once forget that the fruits of the earth belong to us all, and the earth itself is to nobody." From our longitudinal studies and the video we just saw, the man Rousseau points to as the founder of an unjust civil society was probably a child and probably an older brother, a story that is as old as humanity if we refer to the Bible's story of Cain and Abel. Two conclusions stand out from three very different sources: early childhood studies, the Bible, and most major philosophers until Rousseau. First, the focus on the universal age crime curve published for the first time in 1831 by Adolphe Quetelet has overshadowed the fact that the real peak in the frequency of human physical aggression is during childhood. Second, from a social learning perspective, children are not learning to aggress. Indeed, longitudinal studies initiated during infancy confirm that one of the most important challenges for a young human is to learn not to aggress. And this learning starts during the preschool years, along with language development and many other cognitive and social skills. This learning continues throughout the elementary school years and appears to be relatively well in place for the majority by entry into adolescence. The fact that humans start to use physical aggression before they reach their first birthday suggests that there is a strong instinctual genetic basis to humans' use of physical aggression. To understand to what extent the different developmental trajectories of physical aggression are determined by genetic and environmental mechanisms, we of course need genetically and environmentally informative research designs. But to understand the development of these mechanisms, we also need designs that assess the different pathways from conception to adulthood. Our professional lives being shorter than the life of the individuals we study, this enterprise will obviously require hard work for many generations of Stockholm Prize winners and their colleagues. It is common knowledge that human males use physical aggression more often than females. Sexual dimorphism is indeed one of the most robust findings from studies on aggression. However, the developmental origins of these sex differences were studied only recently with large population samples of newborn children. With a sample of more than 2,000 Canadian children, we observed that from 2 years of age onwards, more boys than girls were on the high physical aggression trajectory, while from 4 years of age onwards, more girls than boys were on a high indirect aggression trajectory. Comparing the frequency of aggressive behavior within and between pairs of monozygotic and dizygotic twins is one of the frequently used genetically informative type of studies. The basic logic here is that genetic mechanisms are considered to play an important role if monozygotic twins are more similar than dizygotic twins in the propensity to use physical aggression, because monozygotic twins have the same genes while dizygotic twins share only half of their genes, like brothers and sisters. Twin studies with elementary school children, adolescents, and adults have indeed shown that there is a relatively strong genetic component to the use of physical aggression. To what extent are these genetic determinants of physical aggression active during early childhood? With twins followed from birth, we observed at 20 months of age that the strength of the genetic influences on individual differences were higher for physical aggression than for language development, while the strength of the shared environment influence was higher for language development. Genetically identical twins are also one of the best research designs to control for genetic effects while testing for environmental effects. With a longitudinal study of more than 200 monozygotic twin pairs, we examined whether having an aggressive friend in kindergarten increases one's physical aggression in grade 1. Results clearly showed that children's use of aggression can be influenced through their close friendships, even when genetic effects are controlled. However, in a follow-up study of the same monozygotic twins from middle childhood to adolescence, no effect of best friend's aggression were found, possibly because older children increasingly select their social environment in tune with their genetic disposition. These results suggest that environmental effects may be greater in early childhood than in middle childhood and adolescence. Exactly 13 years ago this month, after a meeting of the Campbell Collaboration Criminology meeting in Paris with Larry Sherman, David Frankton, Friedrich Lozel, David Weisberg, Jerry Lee, and others, I attended a meeting of the Canadian Institute of Advanced Research in Vancouver, where Moishe Schiff, an epigeneticist, presented the results of a study which would be published 2 months later in Nature Neuroscience. The results of that study was initially received by geneticists with much skepticism, but has since then completely changed our perception of the nature-nurture debate concerning human development, and especially the role of early experience. Schiff and his colleagues showed that the frequency of maternal licking of a rat pups in the first few days after birth had an impact on gene expression, on brain development, on behavior, and on life expectancy. Moishe Schiff taught me that the basic point to remember concerning genetic influences and epigenetics is that genes are like piano keys. They can be turned on and off by a pianist through chemical signals. Thousands of studies with animals and humans have now shown that environments play important roles in the development of the brain, behavior, and diseases by programming gene expression from conception on throughout our lives. One of the key advantages of epigenetic research is that it provides a tool to study intergenerational transmission of behavior and health problems. The basic hypothesis is that parents' behavior from conception onwards can impact offspring brain development, behavior, and health through its impact on the offspring's gene expression programming. To study the association between chronic physical aggression and genetic expression, we compared the epigenetic profiles of boys who were on a chronic physical aggression trajectory to boys who were on a normal trajectory. We identified 448 distinct gene promoters that were differentially methylated in the two groups of boys. An identical study with girls showed similar results, but often on different genes. In two further studies with the sample of males, we focused on the association between chronic physical aggression, brain functioning, and gene methylation. This first study used brain imaging to compare brain serotonin synthesis in males on a high physical aggression trajectory and those on a low physical aggression trajectory. Results showed that males on the high aggression trajectory had lower brain serotonin synthesis. The second study hypothesized that this lower brain serotonin synthesis was associated with methylation of critical genes in the serotonin pathway. Higher levels of gene methylation were indeed observed in T cells and monocytes for the high aggression group, who also showed lower brain serotonin synthesis. Finally, the males from the longitudinal study who were not on a chronic physical aggression trajectory from childhood to adolescence were then compared to prisoners with an antisocial personality diagnosis. Results showed that hypermethylation of the MAO promoter gene was associated with a diagnostic of antisocial personality disorder. More recently, in a very important study with a large sample of British children followed from birth, Ted Barker's team showed that higher maternal psychopathology, criminal behavior, and substance use was associated with higher oxytocin receptor gene methylation at birth, and that this DNA methylation at birth was associated with higher callous unemotional traits at age 13 years. Intergenerational research on antisocial behavior has been relatively limited, especially concerning the biopsychosocial mechanisms involved. David Farrington, a Stockholm Prize winner, did show that children of parents who were convicted for criminal behavior are more at risk of being convicted during adolescence and adulthood. With a longitudinal study starting at birth, we showed this association starts very early in life. Maternal reports of their antisocial behavior during their own adolescence was strongly associated with chronic physical aggression of their child between 17 and 42 months of age. This study further showed that the mothers of chronically aggressive children were, at the child's birth, more likely to be among the youngest and poorest, to be separated from the father, to not have completed high school, to have smoked during pregnancy, and to have had postpartum depression. This network of associations illustrates well the fact that the intergenerational transmission of behavior problems probably occurs through numerous interrelated biopsychosocial channels, which can be compared to Hercules' Hydra challenge. The child inherits a mix of his parents' genes, while his mother's smoking, stress, poverty, and depression during pregnancy impacts the fetus' brain development through epigenetic mechanisms. From the postnatal period onwards, the physical and social environments created by a poor, young, depressed woman with low education, behavior problems, coercive parenting in a dysfunctional family clearly fails to provide the care and education needed by the brain of a young child to learn to control his emotions and his behavior. On the contrary, they may further exacerbate the expression of the child's genetic liability and create their own negative epigenetic effects. However, the problems do not start with conception. When we often forget that assortative mating, that is, mating with someone who has similar characteristics, is one of the initial mechanisms that leads to the numerous interrelated biopsychosocial channels which impact human development from pregnancy onwards. A recent population study of more than 700,000 adults here in Sweden showed that there was more assortative mating for mental illness than for physical illnesses. Individuals with a psychiatric diagnosis were 2 times more likely to have a mate with a psychiatric diagnosis. It is important to emphasize that assortative mating brings together, for the reproduction of the next generation, mates that have histories not only for physical and mental health problems, but also for education, ability to self-control, and values on numerous crucial issues for children's development, such as nutrition, discipline, lifestyle, and respect for others. This illustration from the New Reader for Infant School, published here in Sweden in 1886, which was given to me by Professor Redelius some 30 years ago, highlights very well the role of children's education. Will the preschool child follow a trajectory that leads from school to an honorable old age, or from the street to a life of disdain and beggary? Although understanding the development of antisocial behavior is important, the main goal of our research has been to provide information that can help prevent the development of chronic antisocial behavior. The numerous mechanisms involved in the development of chronic physical aggression described above suggest that we need to target many risk and protective factors, a Herculean task, which needs the contributions from many scientific disciplines and different types of professions, because we need to address parents, psychological problems, health problems, and social problems, family functioning, peer interactions, child care, and school environments, as well as biological mechanisms related to brain functioning. Furthermore, because our main findings show that humans start to use physical aggression and other antisocial behavior during early childhood, and that children on a high antisocial trajectory early in life are more likely to maintain higher frequencies of antisocial behavior up to adulthood, we can conclude that intensive and long-term interventions that are initiated early in life are more likely to prevent chronic antisocial behavior problems than interventions which start during middle childhood and adolescence. This is clearly not a new idea. In his essay on education published in 1529, Erasmus wrote, "We should be especially careful with our children during their first years, for at this stage, their behavior is guided by instinct more than by reason, so that they are inclined equally to good and evil, more to the latter perhaps, and it is always easier to forget good habits." Unfortunately, the angelical nature of humans that was promoted by Rousseau during the 18th century dominated the 20th century and is still thriving. For example, as we entered into the 21st century, both the Surgeon General of the United States and the World Health Organization published reports on the causes of violence, concluding that the majority of young people who become violent are adolescent limited offenders who in fact show little or no evidence of high levels of aggression or other problem behaviors during childhood. The results of these beliefs is that most experiments to prevent aggressive antisocial behaviors targeted pre-adolescents and adolescents, and the bulk of the financial resources to prevent antisocial behavior are used for interventions during adolescence. In the early 1980s, we experimented a prevention program targeting the most aggressive, hyperactive kindergarten boys from low socioeconomic area schools in Montreal. The two-year program included a home-based parent training component and a school-based social cognitive skills training component. In comparison to the control group, boys who participated in the prevention program were found to have less self-reported delinquency and substance use during adolescence, to have a higher rate of high school completion and fewer criminal records by 24 years of age. And as reported in one of yesterday's panel by Yann Algan, the intervention also increased participation in the work market and wages. Earlier interventions should have still greater long-term impacts. We showed that children of mothers with a low-level education were less at risk of being on a high physical aggression trajectory if they attended childcare facilities, especially if they started to attend these childcare facilities before 9 months of age. But prevention of behavior problems can start earlier. David Olds, a former Stockholm Prize winner, and his colleagues experimented a prevention program targeting young, unmarried, and poor pregnant women. Results showed that the intervention reduced child abuse and neglect, as well as maternal delinquency, but more importantly, by age 19, their daughters were less likely to have been arrested and convicted. They had less children, and they used Medicaid less often. These results are especially encouraging since the female offsprings become the mothers of the next generation. Interventions starting during pregnancy can also last longer. Orla Doyle presented yesterday encouraging results from a prevention experiment in Dublin that gave five years of support to at-risk families from pregnancy to school entry. The recent knowledge on the early onset and intergenerational nature of physical aggression problems will hopefully be used to plan the next generation of prevention experiments. Parents with a history of behavior problems carry with them pervasive high-risk environmental conditions which impact childhood, adolescence, and adulthood behavior problems through many interrelated channels, including impacts on the children's DNA methylation. Interventions which do not start close to conception cannot impact the many causal pathways that are already in place during fetal life. Interestingly, the first World Health Organization report, published in 1951, was on juvenile delinquency. And one of the recommendations was to help the girls with behavior problems who become the mothers of the next generation of juvenile delinquents. 1951. Epigenetic research has now provided access to one of the main mechanisms by which the intergenerational problems are transmitted. If brain development is compromised through epigenetic effects during pregnancy, and if the child's parents also lack self-control, it is easy to understand that the child will lack the cognitive and environmental support needed to develop the self-control that is essential to learn effective alternatives to physical aggression. From this perspective, mothers are likely to have the greatest impact on early gene expression because their lifestyle during pregnancy has direct biological impacts on the child's early development, including their brain. This epigenetic perspective suggests that successful prevention should be easier to achieve by ameliorating the pre- and early postnatal environment rather than by chasing bad genes or trying to change an individual's environment once he clearly has behavior problems. This developmental way of thinking about chronic problems also applies to many other physical and mental health problems. For example, David Barker, after 40 years of tracking the origins of many chronic health problems, concluded chronic diseases are not the inevitable lot of humankind. We could readily prevent them had we the will to do so. Many babies in the womb in the Western world today are receiving unbalanced and inadequate diets. Protecting the nutrition and health of girls and young women should be the cornerstone of public health. Not only will this prevent chronic disease, but it will produce new generations who have better health and well-being throughout their lives. To be well understood on these intergenerational mechanisms, it is important to emphasize that mothers, fathers, and children should not be blamed for the genes and the environments they inherit at conception and onwards. At-risk families need to receive intensive and long-lasting support to break the intergenerational cycle of chronic behavior problems. For many, it may take more than one generation to achieve this aim. This perspective has been briefly but elegantly summarized by the chief of the Soli people in Zambia. When you educate a man, an individual is educated. When you educate a woman, you educate her children and thus the nation. Finally, I am convinced that we will be in a position to really achieve the same only when our university students will be thoroughly trained to understand and appreciate the long-term biopsychosocial nature of human development. At-risk families need from us teamwork across disciplines over the lifespan and between generations. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Well, I learned a lot. I hope you too. We have 15 minutes for question. You are extremely disciplined. You told me 15 minutes, and it is 15 minutes. So please, if there are any questions, it's time to step forward. I can't see no questions. Larry, thank you very much.
What's methylation?
Methylation is what you put around yourself to keep your belly inside. Methylation is surrounding the gene so that if it's methylated, it can't talk, it can't work. If it's not methylated, it expresses itself.
It's the opposite of expression.
Yeah, well.
Or it's something
Demethylation and methylation.
So it's preventing the gene to act, sort of, or to be active.
Yeah. For those who haven't been in contact, I want to use simple examples. And one of the, when in the womb, at the start of life, as the fetus develops, in each of our in each of our cells, we have all our genes. All our genes are in each of our cells. If, as you imagine, you've seen fetuses, it's sort of, it has really no form. And for the cells, there are cells that have nose genes. If the cells that are here have expressed nose, and the cells that are there should not be expressing nose, because you will have a nose here and a nose there and a nose there. So methylation is a very simple process of development. The genes cannot be expressing themselves, all the genes all the time. So methylation and demethylation is a process that regulates gene expression.
Well, thank you, Larry, to put this question. I didn't dare to do it. Okay, please.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Tremblay, for your lecture. I listened to your panel yesterday and listening to you again today. My question for you is a question that was raised by Thomas Merton, that we are warned to be aware of those crazy people, but actually the more dangerous people are normal. The rapists, the people who kidnap and enslave millions of people, they are normal people, they're not crazy. So how does your theory of even preconception as a solution address the issue of the normalization of violence in today's society?
Okay, that's a very good question. I was not sure where you were going, but it's a very good question. I have shown that the children are the most aggressive we are at our most aggressive when we are children. It's clear that aggression is a tool that humans needed to dominate the world. And it's clear that for any species, aggression is useful for survival. So the aggression that I've been talking about is the aggression that is uncontrolled in the sense that people are behaving in a way that is not adjusted to the environment they are in. Now, it's clear that among humans, and I guess most people here are from universities, it's clear that even among university people, there is a lot of aggression. Not physical aggression, but a lot of indirect aggression. So aggression is something that is relatively common, and when there are conflicts between countries, between neighbors, our aggressive behavior of early childhood can come back and be used. The problem I am talking about here is the problem of individuals that are uncontrolled and are using aggression in an antisocial way within a given society. It's not explaining aggression in war. It's not explaining aggression by people who decide for ideological reason that they will physically aggress others. But I would suggest that within an army, if you have an army and they are attacking those who have less control over their aggression are more likely to be the most aggressive and to a certain extent to be the best soldiers. In the same way that individuals who inherit aggressive genes and learn to control themselves tend to become very useful members of society. So we have to put in context the role of aggression. Aggression in itself is not bad. It's a tool that we have, but it's a tool that we need to control. And then once we are in control, we use it for the purposes that ideologically we want to use them. Thinking that physical aggression will disappear from humanity does not make sense. We are aggressive animals.
Well, one more question. Oh, there are several more questions. We can, if you are so kind and put very short questions, we could take more of them. Please.
Yes. You told that we build a nation when we help a woman. In this point of view, what is the father's place in the early prevention program?
The father's place?
Yes.
Yeah. I think fathers are very important, but we have again to face to our history. We have biologically been made differently, males and females, and that's a very, very long story in terms of evolution. And so it's clear that there are instincts that are different in terms of males and females, and there are competencies that are different in males and females. And if we think about early the fetal life, it's clear that the fathers can be supportive to the mothers and should be supportive to the mothers, but they cannot carry the baby, at least possibly from, we will find a way to do that. But there is a role, it's not by saying the role of mothers is extremely important that we are saying that the role of father is not important. Fathers are extremely important in supporting the mother and in educating the children. But from a perinatal perspective, it's clear that the mothers are central. And as I was saying to the minister yesterday, we are investing much more money in young males than we are in young females that have problems. And from that sense, we really have to change our perspective if we want to have a long-term preventive approach.
Please.
Yeah.
Friedrich, could you wait a second?
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
You are the last one.
Thank you. Yes, a question and a comment. We have been listening and hearing about survey conducted in Western modern countries, North America or Europe, but also I think there are many, many other places in the world with a different culture, different standard of living. I'm wondering if there are any other country where this kind of survey have been conducted, and because we know that some society or some country have a totally different culture. Mothering is different, nurturing is different. So I'm just wondering if you heard of any other studies conducted in a low-income country, developing country, that could be interested to compare the result of our developed country, how high-level income versus developing country and low income, and different culture background.
I have no examples that come to my mind. Most of these studies have been done in Western countries. What is interesting is that even though there are different cultures, the results are similar. But I can't think of any of these studies being done in
Thank you.
Okay. No, thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I interrupt you? No. Well, the last question for Professor Friedrich Löser, who is one of prize winners of the Stockholm Prize in Criminology.
Very briefly, Richard, many thanks for your very convincing talk. I have a question that is related to the funding issue you also mentioned.
The funding?
To the funding you mentioned, what the ministry also in the talk. I am also, as you know, in the field of early developmental prevention, but I'm also in the field of later offender treatment. And there's sometimes a discussion that we should allocate more and more money to the young ones and early developmental prevention. I fully agree with that. On the other hand, money is limited, and there is sometimes a risk, if this policy is started, that the investment into delinquency treatment of young offenders, of early adult offenders, may be reduced, because if they believe us, they say, okay, early prevention is the most promising approach. Am I right that this polarization may be too strong? And when I take your last arguments for the mothers, we could also say, if we can treat a young adult, even a male young adult offender successfully, and there are a number of programs out now in the word literature, this may enhance the probability that a woman does not bad assortive mating. Insofar, there is some justification for later offender treatment, and also our early programs are not totally successful. There are some successes, but a number of people go on even when they have been on good programs. Is this a viewpoint that is acceptable?
I think it all comes down to money. And my lecture, what I think about the world today is that the money is not placed in the right places, that males are getting too much compared to females, and that females are doing a job that is incredible in terms of, I mean, the women used to be mothers at home and men. Now, if you look at our field, I was looking yesterday, and probably if we count, there are much more females in our field than there are males in our schools. The best colleagues are females, and it's clear that they are doing so much more. The women are doing so much more than the males, and we are still advocating for resources for the males. And I mean, it's the same problem with the fact that we live longer, and so more resources to the older people, and the children are getting less resources. So my lecture, I think that the distribution of public service resources is to be rethought completely. And to be more specific to the problem that you are talking about, I think that every time we have a male that is caught for criminal, that has problems related to criminal behavior, the intervention should be mainly on his children and his wife. We can do things with the males, but I think that in the long run, it will pay much more if we give the services to the family rather than to simply this person who has problems with. And if I was a president-elect of a country, that would be one of my first decisions. We cannot arrest someone and not take care of his family.
Thank you. Since we are, well, it's about what I was going to say. Thank you very much. Great pleasure.